Dear friends, to hear James talk sometimes you might have thought that he ran the Fat Controller's railway on his own. He certainly needed no help from diesels, or so he imagined. The other engines were more sensible and realized that diesels could take some of the weight off their own couplings. But now the Fat Controller tells me that James has had a change of heart. These stories tell you how it happened. The author. The engines on the island of Soldor are mostly steam engines. Tortobomhat finds them really useful and refuses to scrap them or replace them with modern engines who are now diesel engines. But that doesn't mean he hates diesel engines. He finds them useful as well. Remakes traffic engines mean that they can pull both coaches and freight cars, and that helps the railway a lot. One day, Sir Topham-Hatt was at the sheds where Boko, Bear, and James were at.
I'm glad that I can trust you diesel engines to help the steam engines on this railway. You really are useful engines.
Boko and Bear were very pleased to hear that, but James, however, was cross. He liked Boko and Bear just fine, but he treated the other diesels like they were useless. Sir, you know that diesels don't use coal and water? So how can you even trust them, even after all the trouble they can cause?
Because my railway means business, James. If it was just steam engines, then that would cause more confusion and delay, along with using more budget money on coal and water. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, sir. It does.
Good. Now I don't want to hear any more complaining from you for the rest of the day. You got that?
Yes, sir. I do.
That's better. Now, off to work, you three.
And he walked away while the three engines went to do their daily work. But later that night, Sir Topham-Hatt came back to the sheds to tell everyone there that he's borrowing a diesel engine from the other railway for a while to help them with the spare jobs. The engines wasn't sure about that. It feels as if he never learned his lessons from the past offense with diesel engines. Not even Boko and Bear liked the news about the new diesel. When the next day came, a roaring sound was heard from far away, but then it got closer and closer. It was clear that the new diesel has arrived. He stopped at the sheds and looked around, but then he snorted about it.
I have to share this shed with steam engines? Ha! Why does the controller of this island keep deep objects like you? He should scrap you and replace you with us diesels. That way, this railway wouldn't be such a joke. Back on my railway, steam engines and diesel engines are supposed to sleep in separate sheds, and we don't mind that at all. In fact, we love the rules so much so we don't have to deal with each other every night. Plus, steam engines aren't allowed to go to the main line without permission, and it rarely happens. Oh, the joy!
This made Boko very cross. He immediately disliked the diesel for having such a rude attitude.
Well, guess what? This railway is completely different from yours, whether you like it or not. We treat each other fair, and even if we don't like each other as well. Now, you will sleep over there so you don't sleep right next to a steamy and complain about it. Do I make myself clear?
The diesel said yes and started doing the spare work that he's asked to do. He was seeing steam engines all around him, and he kept cringing more and more whenever he passed one. Not even the other engines liked him one bit and hoped that he doesn't last long on the island. When the next morning came, the diesel waited for all the engines to get out of the shed so he doesn't have to hear the engines cringing at him. When he was the last one at the sheds, he was pleased.
Finally, I can get to work and we'll have to deal with those stinky steam engines again today.
But what he didn't know was that there was an oil bill from Boko on the turntable, but he didn't even notice. When he got to the turntable, he slipped and kept on moving. He tried to put on his brakes, but it was no use. Then there was even more trouble. He immediately crashed into one of the other sheds. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but he was off the rails and was damaged from what just happened. Later that day, Douglas was cleaning up the mess when Henry and James came back from the day's work. They were surprised to see the mess. "What happened here, Douglas?" Apparently, there was some oil spill on the turntable and the diesel slipped on it and couldn't stop on time before he crashed into this shed. So now he's going to the works to be repaired and probably go back to the other railway.
Looks like old Stuck-Up got what he had coming. Maybe the same thing should happen to the next diesel who's rude and calls us out of date like this one did.
The diesel didn't say anything as he was embarrassed and his face was turning red as James's paint. James had a serious problem with the diesel engines. He doesn't hate all of them, but most of them can seriously get on his nerves, especially the last diesel. But the other engines on Sodor accept them.
I think they're alright, James. They're definitely like us, like being mixed traffic engines.
You mean mixed up engines? They can be nothing but trouble. I mean, look at them. They have two cabs, so how can they even see when someone is coming?
Well, the perfect example of that is Toby. He has two cabs and he can see just fine without any trouble.
But here's the difference. Toby is small, and most of the diesels are big. I can't even tell which way to go very well whenever I go backwards. Sometimes I just wonder what this railway is even becoming. The engines decided to say nothing to him and all agreed that James was just getting into his smoke box and being puffed up as well.
I can't tell if he's making out with his royalty or something. It's just times like this where I just can't stand him. It's disgusting.
That's funny, because I once knew an engine named King James back in Paddington. The difference is that he didn't swerve around, or care about his paintwork, or being a hothead.
That's a shame. Otherwise we would have been telling this to James about that. Then he would change his mind about his actions. It's better than misery he be making in our lives.
I agree, but we're trim as wheels for him. We don't even have hands to do it ourselves.
The engines tried to come up with many ideas, but they got nothing. James got so annoyed that he puffed out of his shed. The engines were very proud that he did, so they wouldn't deal with his nonsense till nighttime. When James got to the yards, the coaches and trucks were annoyed by him as well. James hated it and did his job. Shouting. It would be a lot easier if the Scottish twins did it. Then this job would have been done much quicker. But Donald and Douglas had to help Edward on his branch line. He got crosser and crosser as time passed by. He shunted the trucks so hard that they were screaming in pain. Ow! What in the world is happening? The single man accidentally fell asleep after drinking hot cocoa, so when James got his load of trucks ready, he blew his whistle. That made the single man jump and thought it was another engine, so he switched the points at the worst timing. Some of the trucks went to the other tracks and couldn't stop, but then it got even worse. One of the trucks went off the tracks and hit the signal, and fell straight down to the tracks. Everything was a mess. Sir Topham Hatt walked out of his office immediately and saw the mess. He walked up to James and spoke to him.
James, you have caused a serious accident. It's a good thing that nobody got hurt. But you should know better than to go while the points have been switched. Now the stations will be delayed till this mess is cleared up.
James knew that it wasn't his fault, but he didn't want to make things worse, so he kept quiet. When he was at the sheds that night, he could hear the other engines talking about what happened that day.
Well, I guess James proved us that it is difficult to see what's behind us since we don't have two cabs. We better be more careful now since we only have one, or else we will cause an accident like James did.
The other engines laughed. James ignored them and went to sleep at once, hoping he wouldn't have another rough day. You see, back when Flying Scotsman and I were built back in the early 1920s, we were both painted green. We really liked the color he was given, but I thought it looked silly on me, and I needed a new coat of paint that suits me. So when time passed by, I was finally given this blue coat, and I loved it. Ever since then, I kept this bad boy color on me, and I will never ask for a different color. I know how you feel, Gordon. When Dougie and I were first built, we were painted blue instead of black. But our old mean controller hated it and didn't give us a chance to go out wearing the color. So we were repainted to black instead. But on the positive side, it still fits us.
I was already green when I was first built, and I thought it fitted me well. I never asked the repair yards for a different color. I like the way I am. If I did ask for a different color, it'd probably be red. But then again, I would look more like James instead of Gordon, or worse, a fire engine. None of those two details would ever work for me.
Oh, really? Then how can you explain the time when you had to take the express while you were still wearing just your undercoat and look like a red and green engine?
That wasn't my fault, James. I had to do it as an emergency at the last minute.
Well, at least someone saw you coming with that red color instead of camouflaging in the background of the grass, but at least people can hear you coming. If it wasn't for that, then you would wear that black and yellow stripes like Maven the Salty. All the other engines laughed very hard at James's roast to Henry, but Henry didn't find that funny at all. He found it very offensive and went to sleep at once. But the very next morning, when he was getting ready for the morning express, he was still upset and not in the bright mood. He bumped up to the coaches really hard, not paying attention at all while he was mumbling to himself.
How can things get any worse for me?
The guard blew his whistle, and Henry set off in a big heave. Things were moving along nicely, but Henry was still having a temper and was wondering how he could get back at James. When he made it to the next station, he bumped the coaches really hard. And he did it again when he set off. But what nobody noticed was that there was a rattle under his bunker, and little did anyone realize was that it would get much worse. Everything was going well. Even Henry was feeling much better. He was in a better mood and was running on time.
I mustn't be late.
But then trouble happened. His cab made a loud noise and caused a big crack.
Whoa, look out!
We need to stop right now.
And that's exactly what happened. Henry was coming to a stop right away, but then he got separated from his tender, and he was in serious shock.
You have got to be kidding me! And I thought using a different kind of coal was bad enough.
We need to get his fire out of here. It'd be too dangerous to leave it going and make his water run dry. I'll go tell the signalman about this while you take care of the fire.
I agree. I'd rather not make anything worse. Sorry, Henry. Just when things were running well. I think if it wasn't for all that banging you caused, none of this would have happened.
Okay. The driver jumped out and went to talk to the signalman about what happened and called for help, while the fireman was taking care of putting out the fire. But things didn't go well as planned. When the driver returned, he can see a big cloud of smoke covering most of Henry.
Holy smokes! What happened?
I tried to put out the fire, but it kept getting worse, so I had to get it out of this smoke box. And now this is what's happening.
The driver didn't ask any more questions, and he jumped into Henry to get him out of the smoke. Soon, Thomas and Percy brought the water tank to take out the fire, and Edward came to take the express for him. When the fire was out, the workmen got their chance to put in a new coupling for his tender, so it doesn't fall off again. The driver slowly moved Henry to his tender and he coupled up to it. He was very embarrassed and was worried about what the engines would say to him. But what he didn't know was that Edward was the one telling the engines about the whole thing. James and Donald laughed really hard. They told the others that night at the shed.
I know I said something about using a red color so people can see me, but I didn't think that Henry would actually need help from two small tank engines to take out the fire like a fire engine. How does that feel for you, Henry?
But Henry didn't say anything else. He knew that it was best not to say any rude comments about the engine's coat of paint. Otherwise, it'd cause even more trouble for him. It was winter time on Sodor. The ground was covered in snow. The water had turned into ice, and the air was freezing. The engines always feel the cold air every morning when they wake up. Their fires always help them warm up so they can get on with their day. One morning, James's crew was getting him ready for the day's work, but they needed to get warmed up first. So they were getting warmed up from his fire. When it was time to go, they set off. But they needed to refill James's water tank, and yet some of the water towers were frozen. But thankfully, they made it to one that wasn't frozen.
This water is going to be cold as heck, James, so you better be ready when it goes down your water tank.
It's better than nothing, I guess. Let's get this over with.
That's the spirit. Now let's fill up your tank right now.
So the water went down into his tank. It was freezing, and James felt like he went underwater for an hour and came out of it at nighttime when it's not warm to cool down. But something went wrong. His fireman forgot to tell the driver to turn the tap off, so water was overflowing on James. He was very shocked about it. It felt even more freezing than it already was.
Whoops, sorry about that, James.
At least we know that your tank is now full. Now let's get going so I can get warm again by the fire after shoveling more coal.
You're telling me I'm ready to get out of this darn cold weather.
Easy for you to say. I'm feeling even more cold than ever. I better not turn into a train-sicle.
Oh, don't be so dramatic, James. You'll be back in the sheds before you know it.
They set off to get their load of freight cars ready. As they were on their way, James was all of a sudden feeling thirsty and told his driver that he needs some water. So the driver turned on the injector, but nothing happened. He tried again, and still nothing. James was slowing down more and more.
Oh, I'm feeling so much pain. Why isn't anything working?
Your injector has failed, so something is blocking the pipe. We'll have to stop it and ask for help.
I hope the water didn't turn into ice. That's causing the pipe to be clogged.
You'll be right, too. The weather's too cold for the water to melt right away.
They came to a stop by the single box. His fire was still going, but James still can't move at all. His driver went to the single man to call for help.
Oh man, Henry will never let me forget about this. It'll be like his payback for all the teasing I gave him.
Don't worry, James. We're not going to do the same thing as Henry did. We're just going to keep the fire going to keep the three of us warm.
Well, what about the coal? Aren't you worried that we'll run out?
Well, we'll get more once we fix the problem in the water pipe.
James felt a bit better after hearing that. The workers got the news about James's problem and sent a diesel to help James to take him there. James was really surprised. It was a diesel that he had never even seen before.
Getting rescued by a diesel? This is definitely unexpected.
Once his fire was cooled off, the diesel started to push James to the works, because it was easier to push him without the fire going. 5 minutes later, they made it to the works. James thanked the diesel for helping him, and the diesel replied with a happy horn. His fireman helped figure out the problem. He went to his boiler and found the problem.
I knew it. The tank won't open because it's frozen from overflowing. The ice is stopping the air to get in the tank, so it's not letting the water do its thing.
Well, that's just brilliant. What will happen next today?
Don't worry. Once the ice melts on your boiler, the water will melt inside of you as well. Then the injector will be working again.
James wasn't happy to hear all that. He wanted to get back to the sheds where it's warm, but then he realized something. If it wasn't for the diesel to take him to the works, he would have been stuck in the cold breeze even longer. That made him change his mind about diesels.
Not all of them are devious, nor want steam engines to be scrapped. A lot of them are actually really useful. Maybe I should pay attention more to diesels after all, and not my splendid red coat of paint.